I am here with Dr. Bair. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. How
That's
do I
right.
pronounce it? There we go. Okay, first try.
Asatar Bair.
And so yeah, we're here pretty much to talk about capitalism and communism. Put each of them on trial and see if we can come to any sort of reconciliation. Which I doubt that we will, but I think it could be an interesting conversation. Someone has suggested, I think, that I speak to you, and that's kind of how we ended up with this conversation. If you want, just introduce yourself and give us your perspective on capitalism, communism. Go from there.
Sure. Well, my name is Asatar Bair. I'm a professor of economics at Riverside City College, Southern California, and a YouTuber and active on Twitter. And I'm known for discussing communism, socialism, and I also teach meditation. So I'm lesser known for that, but that's something I do as well. Um, so yeah, when I think about um, you know what is this, right? What is the, if you're a communist or whatever, what are you advocating for? um, we have this statement from Marx, and it's a very old one. Actually, it predates Marx and Engels by hundreds of years, right? Which is, communism is, you know to each according to need, and from each according to ability, right? So you know that's a nice little tagline. It's good that there's a tagline, but of course the big question is, like, what does that mean? How does that connect to modern society that we see in all of its complexity, right? um, so Marx and Engels also try to deal with this, right? They say, well, how do we understand modern society? And so we have this in the Communist Manifesto, right? What's a good way of understanding modern society? Well, history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle, right? The elite class that stays in its elite position, which sucks up power and wealth by oppressing and exploiting the vast majority of people, right? And that is modern history. And I think that's a pretty good summary. I mean, if you were from another planet, you're like, tell me about planet Earth, right? That's the line I would drop on you. Look, here's our history. Okay, we have modern history. That's the history, right? It's a small class that exploits the rest of us. And they go, oh, okay, wow, you haven't moved beyond it. I can see, right? I can see you're going to have a lot of problems as a result, right? Yeah, we do. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think in general that makes sense. So I guess it depends on who I'm speaking with because I think similar to capitalism, every economic system is going to have a lot of different variants and interpretation within itself. So there's right wing libertarians that would call me a filthy socialist because I think that things like the government preventing you from polluting the water might make some sense. Just the smallest bit of sense. And things like a progressive income tax might make sense as well. Social security is a good thing, right? These things to some
Right.
people might not make me a capitalist, might make me a socialist. Obviously, that's kind of ridiculous if you understand the sort of a historical, the sort of foundation of socialism isn't probably just that the government does things and provides services. There's a bit more to socialism than that. And under a lot of frameworks, socialists wouldn't consider many of the socialist governments of history socialist, right? A lot of people take issue with the idea that the Soviet Union was socialist. A lot of people would say Yugoslavia is both of the best, but also the worst example of socialism. When it comes to your brand of socialism, paint the society for us to frame the conversation. What does society look like if Dr. Bayer has implemented his own socialism?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the issue that we're sort of talking around is, like, what is socialism, right? So when somebody says it is or it isn't, does or doesn't exist, right? I mean, like, what bundle of qualities, right? What is their definition? What is socialism? And the problem is that this is a very contested term. I mean, and that's true of all the big terms here. Like capitalism. What's that, right? That's also a contested term. Like when you talk to libertarians or anarchists or small government people, right? They will often not use the term capitalism to describe what we have, because to them capitalism is sort of the ideal, right? Like, well, maybe not anarchists, right? This is libertarians, right? Capitalism to them is an ideal state. And so you'd say, well, where does capitalism exist? And they'd say nowhere, right? Because what we have is something else called corporatism or called crony capitalism or whatever the hell, right? Now, I don't agree with that perspective, right? I think capitalism is the dominant system in the world today, right? And what are its characteristics, right? Well, there's a capitalist labor market, right? You are forced to sell your labor power, and you don't have an alternative to that, right? And the way the labor market works, right? You exchange your time for a wage, right? I mean, that's the way it works, and most people don't have the ability to opt out of that, right? They don't have access to their own land or other means of production that make that a real option, right? It's pretty much work or die, right? And you have to pretty much accept the wages that you're offered. Maybe you can tinker around the edges of it a little bit, right? Get a better education, or get accumulate the skills that seem to be in demand at the moment, right? But that is basically the situation for almost everyone, right? I mean, how much liquid wealth would you need to be able to not live that way, right? Um, well, right, that's sort of the question, right? But the answer to it is not many people are going to have that, right? So, okay, if that's capitalism, right? So the employer-employee relationship is what predominates. That's what most people must engage in, right, as employees. Um, and then we look at society as organized on the basis of profit, right? And the government, what does the government do? The government assists this process as best as it can, right? It assists the capitalist class in accumulating surplus from the worker, right? That's what it does, And Marx and Engels describe this as, this is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, right? So government works on behalf of the capitalist class, and I don't think that that is a surprise to anybody who observes any government today, right? You look at the United States government, and what do they do, right? I mean, they say they're here. Oh, we're here to help the middle class, but that's not really what they do. I mean, let's be honest, right? Like, like if the middle class solidly supports some idea, like let's say the middle class gets the idea that everyone should have health care, which, by the way, that's the situation, right? That is a super majority, that agree with this, even among Republicans, right? So you would imagine that, given that this is a democracy, that we would be pretty close to passing that, right? And of course, we're nowhere near that, right? That's um, what does the government use its resources for? It uses it to assist the capitalist class. I think that's pretty much indisputable. But let me just pause for a moment. Are we on the same page here? What is capitalism? Anything to say?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think that I think you're coming at it with a different framework than me. To me, capitalism is private investment. I think is fundamentally how I would frame my own capitalism. Is the idea that you can you can invest in a business with capital, with money, and that investment comes with actionable decision making capacity, right? So if I invest and buy 20% of a business, that gives me 20% of the say, and my relationship with that business is not necessarily predicated on my labor, but rather based on my investment. To me,
Yeah,
that's sort of capitalism in a
investment
micro
is
view.
organized on the basis of profit, right? I mean, like that's pretty clear. I mean, you didn't mention that, but that's part of it, right?
Yeah, sure. I think I disagree sort of to some extent with the framing, of course, because I'm a capitalist and not a socialist. The idea of the exploitative relationship and stuff like that. I think there's arguments to be made there. But yeah, fundamentally, private investment, profit incentives, stuff like that. I think that there's probably room for ambiguity here. So, for instance, many people are market socialists nowadays, right? The idea of every business being sort of cooperatively owned. Is this capitalism? Well, it has a profit motive, but the sort of employer-employee relationship has been collapsed to a certain extent. So, is this capitalism? It seems like kind of an in-between kind of thing. So, barring some ambiguities, yeah, I think we're fundamentally, seemingly on the same wavelength.
Yeah. Well, good. Let's work on that then, because the question that you raised at the end there, I think, is a good one, which is what is this, right? When you have workers that collectively, own the means of production, right? Or they don't have a boss, they work in a cooperative fashion. What is this? Is this capitalism? So, in Marxism, you have this difference between the term mode of production, right? Mode of production is like a kind of macro level view of the economy, right? To say what is the relationship between the producer, the direct producer, the one who produces value, right? And the one who takes that and owns that value, right? So the producer and the appropriator. Um, what is the kind of dominant one of these, right? And Marxism separates them into different categories, right? So we have feudalism, right? We have slavery, we have capitalism, we have communism, and we have one that is not really settled. Sometimes it's called petty bourgeois. Sometimes it's called ancient, right? It's where the worker individually produces and appropriates, right? So we have different things going on here, right? Because we can say, look, there's a lot of different arrangements in a society where, like, where who produces and who takes the product. There's a number of different ways that can go. But we could say, look, okay, fine, right? Every workplace is different, but what's the overall, view from 30,000 feet kind of thing, right? And that's mode of production, right? So we might look at the South, for example, in the US South during the antebellum period, and we'd say, well, that's slavery, right? Slavery is the dominant mode of production in that society. But does that mean that there was nobody working for a wage in the antebellum South? No, that's not true, right? Does that mean there was no individual producers, right, who weren't owned by anybody, but they're just producing commodities for the market? Let's say a carpenter, right? Here they are selling their services, right? Carpentry services. They don't have a boss, right? They're their own boss, right? So in every society, you have the big picture, right? The mode of production, and then you get down into the weeds, you get into the details, and you find that there's a lot of differences emerging there, right? So you could have, for example, a mode of production that's capitalist, right? But within that, you could have things that are exist on the margin, right? They're not dominant, but they still take place, right? You could have slavery taking place under capitalism, right? I mean, we have lots of examples of that in the last few hundred years. You can have what we call small business, right? These individual commodity producers. So they're not employers, right? Neither are they employees. So it's something different that we're doing, right? Is this part of capitalism? Is it different from capitalism? What if the workers work together and rather than having a boss, they're all the boss, right? What is that? So, Marxism makes a distinction between mode of production, the big picture, and class process, right? Which is that's the micro version of this, right? What is happening at the point of production? And what we know is, yeah, you could have the at the point of production, you could have a group of workers producing. Now, would we call that then communism? I mean, these isms they sort of lend themselves to like the big picture analysis, right? So my mentors in Marxism, this is Richard Wolff and Stephen Resnick, who's now passed away, but this is who I studied with, and they draw this out of the Marxist tradition and say the class process, the micro level, that is unique, right? Like I say, every workplace is unique. Um, and we want to draw a distinction between that, right? There's multiple class processes going on in any mode of production, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. So I guess with that understanding, we can kind of get into the more back and forth sort of substantive disagreement. So I guess fundamentally, my view is it appears based on the way that you describe society, or I suppose the way that you describe socialism and sort of the antithesis, which might be capitalism, the idea that the workplace relationship and the sort of profit motive, right? That these are the foundational elements of capitalism, and socialism is to some great part the antithesis of that, where you sort of collapse the employer-employee relationship to a certain extent, and the profit motive, sort of commodity production, sort of goes out the window. Is that a fair understanding?
Well, in the socialisms that we've seen so far, there's still commodity production, right? I mean, that's still the basis. Now, you see
Right.
arguments sometimes in Marxism that it is a different form of commodity production, right? So, and this forces us to kind of analyze, well, what is a commodity? What is it? What does commodity production mean, really, right? Does commodity production automatically entail that you're producing for a profit or not, right? I mean, like, all of those questions come up, right? And so, I want to be sensitive to, like, there are differences of opinion even within Marxism, right? About, what does this mean, right? If commodity means, in the loosest definition, it means an item that's produced for the purpose of selling it in a market. then every kind of socialism that we've seen thus far has involved commodity production, right? I mean, like
Right.
goods and services are produced for the purpose of selling them on a market. Now, maybe those prices are not set by the market, and maybe they're set by the government, right? And on what basis are they set? Well, they're set on a basis of what is the overarching goals of that society at that time, right? And so, and this is where we get into like, well, what is socialism, right? Socialism is when society is organized not on the basis of profit, right, but on the basis of the needs of the populace, right? Now, again, this is a pretty vague statement, right? And whether or not that's occurring, I mean, we should expect there to be a lot of debate around that, right? As much perhaps as we might expect when we ask a question, is the society democratic, right? I mean, like, wow, it's a pretty big question, right? What does it mean to be democratic? Oh, the will of the people or whatever. That's a pretty vague phrase, right? Like, how do we know that the will of the, how do we know what that is, right? How do we know it's being reflected, et cetera, right? So, a lot of our big questions that we ask of society are pretty hard to answer on that level, right? So we should expect nothing different when it comes to the question, is this society socialist or not, right? Now, me personally, I look at what have the results been, right? What are the results? Don't look at the rhetoric. I mean, every politician gives you some pretty rhetoric, right? I mean, Joe Biden, right? Oh, we're doing all of this for the working class, for the middle class, whatever, right? And every politician, the good ones, they have to talk that way, um, even if they do it with a wink and a nod to their actual donors, right? The ones who actually fund their campaigns. Um, so if we committed to the issue of like what are the results that a society is generating, I look at the existing history of socialism, and I'm talking about the first socialist state, right? That's the Soviet Union. We can look at China. We can look at Vietnam. We can look at Cuba. We can look at all of the countries that have, taken up, revolution under the banner of Marxism, right? And we can look at, well, what have they actually done, right? Now, did they abolish commodities? Like this is often, a big thing. Many Marxists have this as a kind of desiderata, right? Because it's like, this is the seen as the grand ultimate in Marxism, right? And so have they done that? The answer is very unambiguous in my view. No, right? They haven't done that. Have they abolished exploitation, right? Exploitation is carefully defined in Marxism, right, as when those who take the surplus are different from those that produced it, right? Um, so did these societies abolish that? No, they didn't, right? You have the state, right? The state becomes the employer. Now, okay, there's variations with this, whatever, right? But let's just, if we stick to like the Soviet example, the state becomes the employer, right? The state owns all the means of production. So you still have an employer-employee relationship. You just don't have it with many different competing capitalists, right? You have it with the state and the worker, right? And so, the Soviets were well aware of this, right? Lenin says the best way to describe this is state capitalism, right? But that's not the end of the story, right? Because then the question is, okay, what does the state do with these surpluses that it takes in from workers, right? And I think the answer really couldn't possibly be clearer in the case of the Soviet Union. They use it to rapidly and massively improve the lives of tens of millions of people, right? In fact, when we look at it, we find it's one of the most rapid and most massive, right, increase in the ordinary well-being of people that history's ever seen. And I think that is kind of like where we start. That's like the bottom line reading. That's, a reasonable reading of Soviet history, right? That is where the debate should start. But I recognize that's not where the debate starts, right? Like me saying that makes me sound like an insane person, right? Because our discourse is so far from that, right? Our discourse is more like, oh, socialism, good idea, but it ends up killing millions of people. I mean, that is so wrong, right? I mean, they talk about not being backed up by every piece of data that we have, right? Because the Soviet Union improved the quality of people's lives by every single metric that we have, right? Life expectancy doubles, right? Infant mortality shrinks to a tiny fraction of what it was, right? It goes on and on and on, right? Literacy. I mean, like, the by every single measure that we could look at, even height, right? Like, were people eating enough calories? Well, you know what happens when you get enough calories? You get taller, right? I mean, this is what happens on average in society, right? That happened very rapidly in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Um,
I
so
mean, I think
again,
I
by
think
every single measure we have, people's lives got a lot better. That's what I mean by results, right?
well, I think that if we're being results oriented, it's not unreasonable, right? That look at economic output, look at inequalities, look at well-being, look at sort of the material condition of people. That's
Yep.
understandable, right? But we can also see similar successes in capitalist countries. I think that the
In
issue is,
some capitalist countries.
well, sure, obviously, if we look at the worst examples of socialism or the worst examples of capitalism, these are both hellscapes, right? And we probably wouldn't want to live in either society. And so now, if we at the same time, if we compare what we might view as the best examples of what you might tilt as more socialist countries, look at the Soviet Union, maybe China, and we compare those to the best examples of sort of capitalist countries, these are still pretty disparate standards of living. And if we are being results oriented, what we find, I think, isn't necessarily that one mode of production, in an esoteric sense, necessarily causes a better or worse standard of living, but rather, as you said, I think properly, what do you do with surplus? How is wealth distributed? What are the mechanisms by which we redistribute wealth and by which we uplift people out of poverty? And in my view, a system that allows for private investment, that allows for sort of profit incentives under a democratic framework, that allows for redistribution and robust welfare programs, unionization, worker board membership, even democratic structures in the workplace, which unions and worker board membership and sort of employee stock ownership plans, that's what those are. Those are the
Right.
systems that are best. They're more flexible. They have been proven to be robust and able to be resilient over time. And ultimately, if we look at the successes of the Soviet Union or China, modern day China, what we see is that yes, it turns out when the state does some stuff, they can do some of that stuff pretty well, right? Most capitalists, most economists, I mean, you're an economist, you know this. Most economists agree with the idea that the state has to be involved and regulate and perhaps provide services directly because some markets fail. Some markets don't provide for that social well-being. In Economics 101, you're going to learn the idea that the market outcome isn't necessarily the socially optimal outcome, right? We might look at polluting a river as an example. If you're allowed to pollute the river, maybe you make more profit, maybe the market clears better, but there's externalities there which the governments has to take care of. So that's my view. I just don't, in
Well, yeah,
my
the
opinion.
externalities would prevent the market from really clearing, right? You would have a social marginal cost, for example, that was higher than the private marginal cost, right? So
Yeah, and
the
so
market
that's
would
that's
clear, but at the wrong location, right?
yeah, and that's my thought is just that we can always agree. I think that sometimes the government doing things makes things better. Sometimes the government doing a lot of stuff makes things better, as is the case with a lot of the Nordic economies that many progressive capitalists like myself might hold up as the shining examples of capitalism and sort of that mixed system. But I don't
Do you
think that the Soviet
think the
Union
world
and China
be like
broadly are
Nordic
good examples.
economies? Do you think that's a viable way forward for, let's say, the rest of the capitalist world to be like Sweden or Norway or Finland or whatever?
So I think that if you're talking about, can every society take advantage of private investment and capital markets whilst at the same time having a robust welfare system and worker representation? I mean, I think the answer is yes.
You are familiar though with what happens to countries that say they want to take the social democratic path, you know? That is, leave most private capital in place, right? But maybe they have a few national enterprises, you know? I mean, Nordic countries do after all, right? They're not completely opposed to nationalization. They might have a few, but their economy tends to be dominated by private capital, right? Is that a fair description?
What do you mean by dominated? You have to be precise there because it really depends.
Most enterprises that if we looked at the share of the economy, you would find most of them are private, right? Not most of them are state. They have high taxes, yes. But when we look at who owns the means of production, it is not the government by and large, right? With maybe a couple of exceptions. They might own a couple of important industries. but they do not own the entirety of the means of production. Very far from it, right?
Well, I think that yes, to a certain extent, and it depends on the country and it depends on how you might view that kind of thing, right? So, for instance, in Norway, 60% of the wealth of Norway is controlled under the social wealth fund of that nation. Under a democratic framework, a 60% of the wealth is collectivized. It's owned
Well,
by
no, no,
the
no. That's
people.
not collectivized. That's a sovereign wealth fund which is invested. Right? I mean, this is what you're referring to.
Yeah, yeah. I'm talking about, the wealth of the nation, right? That 60% of it is under
That's
a
not the wealth of the
conglomerate.
nation. Though. This is. I mean, if we want to talk about the wealth of the nation, we're talking about real GDP. We're
No,
not
we're
talking
not.
about a small diversion of funds, which is essentially savings, and it's not even all savings, right? It's a portion of that.
No, but
I mean,
GDP isn't the wealth of a country, right? I mean, the wealth of, so for instance, right? My annual income isn't my wealth. My wealth is the
right.
accumulations of my consumption and annual income, right? And so from my view, if you're looking at the
But
accumulation
total
of that
wealth
wealth,
isn't really the thing we want to look at, though, right? Because it's tiny relative. I mean, just like most people's savings, right? Most people's wealth is tiny relative to their income. I mean, that's the reality of how
um,
99%
no,
live.
that's not. I don't think that that's true. I think it is also especially not true when it comes to almost every country in the world has a much larger wealth than they do annual GDP, right?
Yeah,
Because
but
it
that's not the
accumulates.
relevant figure, though, right? Because when you look at wealth, you're looking at total assets, right? You're looking at the value of land, means of production, financial assets, et cetera, right?
Sure.
Very little of this is liquid, very little of this is something you could actually do something with, right? We
No, I get what you're
the
saying. We might be talking past each other. I'm just saying that it does depend on what you mean. For instance, I was talking to a socialist, I think, a couple weeks ago, who would actually label Norway as a mostly socialist economy because of this 60% of the wealth is owned by sort of the sovereign wealth fund. But that's why I mean it depends on what you mean by sort of the mode of production, the sort of predominance of organization in an economy. To go back to your original question, as far as I'm aware, no state-owned enterprises, like a majority. It is a minority of the public that works in state-owned enterprises. Private businesses account for the majority of economic activity in these
right.
countries to this day. Yeah.
What I was trying to get to with this question is, what we see internationally is we see like if a country moves in even just a social democratic direction, now, they might use the term socialism to describe that, maybe not, right? But let's say if their policy objectives are similar to Norway, let's say, right? Okay, we're gonna nationalize or just keep one industry nationalized, and the rest we will leave in private hands. But we want the government to do more for the average person. We want the government to do social welfare. We want the government to create a kind of a social safety net, right? The Nordic model. Well, what happens when a country does that? Venezuela springs to mind, right? Venezuela, you have this is kind of like the market socialist dream, right? You have a socialist who comes into power through elections, right? There's no revolution, there's no violence, right? There's an election, and Chavez wins the election, right? What happens? Well, the country gets sanctioned, the country gets heavy flack from the United States. I mean, you don't see the social democratic model succeeding anywhere in Latin America because they're going to face a coup from the United States.
No,
They're
that's not
gonna,
true at all, though.
whether it's successful or not, they're going to face some kind of pushback from the
I, I
capitalist class in the former
I
United States.
really disagree though with this. I mean, because you do see the social democratic model as you might describe it with. So, for instance, if you're describing the social democratic model as implementing welfare structures, sort of state-owned enterprises, you see that model with varying forms of success all over Latin America, right? I mean, we see people talk about Evo Morales and the socialist government in Bolivia. You can look at the Rafael Correa government
What
in
happens
Ecuador,
to
which,
Morales in Bolivia, though?
well,
You,
he.
you're aware of the coup attempt there, right?
So I'm aware of the coup attempt, but I'm also aware of the Socialist Party winning the election and currently is still in government in Bolivia, right? So I'm not sure how material it is, especially considering the institutions of Bolivia seem to hold itself up. Now, hold on. I was going to say there's also many other examples, right? We can look at Brazil as example. The largest single-payer healthcare system in the world is in Brazil, and a lot of the good social democratic governments, as a result of the government of the last 2 decades in Brazil, have maintained, and the institutions have held strong there, even under a right-wing government that they have now. And that was all under a democratic framework. Look at Ecuador, which
You should
even
talk to a
with
few Brazilians and ask them if they think that they're in a Nordic model economy.
no, I'm not
I
saying
don't
no,
think
no,
there's
but
enough
you're
many that
no, no,
can
no.
do it.
I'm not saying that they've achieved like Nordic model capitalism, right? But you're using Venezuela as an example. That was your go-to. Now, what I'm saying is that
You're going to face flack.
Venezuela,
If you try to do social democracy in Latin America, you are going to face very heavy flack from the
but
United
you
States.
you you
That's the
didn't.
reality.
No, but okay. As far as I'm aware, there was no coup attempt in Brazil. There was no coup attempt in Ecuador. Ecuador has a state-owned enterprise of their oil company. You know, they have oil wealth, right? That's a predominance of their GDP. Well, not predominance, but that's a huge percentage of their wealth, similar to Venezuela. Venezuela and Ecuador are both by name socialist, uh, heavily oil wealth Latin American nations, right? But you don't see the type of treatment of Venezuela towards Ecuadorian people. Why is that? Well, it's because the dynamics are probably a bit more complicated than just, well, this country tried to do welfare and this country didn't. Like, no, they both did the same thing, but they have vastly different treatments of the international stage. And I think there's explanations outside of the countries did welfare to explain that.
What we see is that countries which do anything which even remotely looks like socialism are going to face very heavy flack from the United States. That's the history of Latin America right there. And
Why didn't Ecuador though? Why didn't Mexico?
uh,
Why didn't Singapore? I mean, these are countries that have actually had
Singapore,
a
Singapore,
yeah.
Singapore. All right.
Uh-huh.
The
What
that's
do
it.
you Yeah, go on.
The United States is willing to do what you call socialism, right? To do planning, to do massive foreign investment in a country with 5-year plans. You know where they do this? They did this. They did this in Taiwan, right? They did this in this province of China. Why? To mess with China, you know? So they do socialism except for that it's, remains under private control, right? But they're willing to invest $100 billion to get this economy moving, right? Even though it involves planning, right? They do a similar thing in South Korea, right? You know, I think you have this idea that free trade or whatever or non-interference with governments is somehow like the U.S. principle. That is not the U.S. principle. The U.S.
No, not
principle
at all.
is control the world, right? And through any dirty tricks imaginable,
No,
and to do
that's
so
not
to prevent socialism from taking hold anywhere.
no, I'm not under the predisposition that the US is acting sort of altruistically by trying to implement free trade or sort of free flow of capital and goods and services. Nothing like that. Obviously, there's a self-interest. Every government is self-interested, and to a certain extent that's maybe righteous depending on who you ask. Obviously, governments should probably represent their people as best that they can. That doesn't mean that governments should engage in human rights violations as capitalist and socialist governments have done, to each their own in that regard. But rather, I'm just pushing back on what I view as a more, uh, you know, uh, sort of this line of thinking, the idea that, oh, if a government that is developing or not developing for that matter implements sort of social democratic frameworks, the idea of welfare programs, education investment, capital investment, physical infrastructure investment, human capital investment, I should say more broadly. The idea that, oh, if you do that, the US or the broader sort of Western capitalist world, sort of global north, will come in and topple your government and say, we don't care about these human rights violations. You're going to need to mine that lithium. You're going to need to, extract that oil for us. That doesn't seem to be a robustly true thing across time. The reason I mentioned Singapore is because Singapore has incredibly, incredibly heavy state intervention in the economy. Ecuador and Venezuela, the two examples, the almost perfect experiments of each other, do not see the same scrutiny on an international scale. And it appears that, like I'm saying, the lens of analysis of you do socialism, you do welfare, you do redistribution, therefore your days are numbered on an international, on the international capitalist most wanted list, doesn't really seem to be robustly true across many, many different examples. Those were just a few.
It certainly is true. It's absolutely true. I mean, you should look at, for example, Indonesia under Suharto. I mean, the United States has very well demonstrated that it's willing to kill, in that case, 1 million people die, right? Or Korea, I mean, the Korean War, the United States kills 4 million people in Korea. Why? To prevent communism from taking root. It's very explicit. I mean, your days are absolutely numbered if you call yourself socialist, right? Now, there's some geopolitical exceptions to this, like why? How come China, right? How come North Korea hasn't been invaded? And there's a very simple answer to that, which is that these are nuclear powers. I mean, the United States doesn't want proliferation, and they should stop invading anybody who tries to do anything, right? I mean, like, so if you have nuclear weapons, or if you have other geopolitical connections which make it inconvenient for you to be invaded, then maybe you won't be, right? And you'll have a proxy war on your hands. You'll be given a huge black eye in the international press, right? The international press will tell a massive number of lies about you. Um, so, I mean, that's the reality of U.S. involvement, right? But we're getting back to the reason I raise this is just to say, is it possible for a Nordic form of capitalism to become the dominant form of capitalism in the world? Because that's not capitalism in its dominant form. If we look at the world right now, right, that is not, outside of like a few wealthy countries in Europe, that's where the Nordic model exists, right? You don't look at Brazil and say that's part of the Nordic model. Nobody does, right? Because it's simply not. Yeah. The reality in Latin America and Africa and Asia is not this, enlightened form of capitalism. And so we could ask the question, well, could that exist there, right? And what I look at is I'm like, well, how did we get this welfare capitalism or this Nordic model to begin with? And the answer seems to be, like the first thing of what we would call the welfare state is like Bismarck's Germany, right? Now, why did Bismarck introduce these reforms? Knowing that they were going to cost a lot of money, knowing that the capitalist class, does not generally favor that, right? Because that takes money away from the government's support of private capitalism, right? So why did they do it? Well, because there was a very significant risk of a socialist revolution in Germany at the time, right? And Bismarck quite explicitly said, we are going to take the wind out of the sails of this socialist movement by giving some of what they want, right? And retaining control of the economy, okay? So that we don't have workers controlling the government, we still have private capitalists controlling the government. That seems to be the birth of the welfare state, right? And that took hold in various places because of the threat of armed socialist revolution. That is my reading of the history. These things did not arise by accident, right? They arose because you had the Soviet Union, for example, right? Now, that's not relevant to Bismarck, right? But we have to keep in mind that Marx and Engels, when they wrote the Communist Manifesto, they thought that the revolution would occur in Germany. And it actually came rather close. So if it hadn't been for Bismarck's intervention there, perhaps things would have gone a different way, right? What I see is welfare capitalism or the Nordic model or whatever you want to call it is basically a response to the very real threat of socialist revolution. But when that becomes less of a threat, like say with the fall of the Soviet Union, well, you see this huge collective sigh of relief coming from the bourgeoisie, right? And then what do? Well, they start stripping away their welfare provisions. I mean, what do you see in Britain? They have the NHS, right? Well, NHS is under constant threat, right? It's getting defunded all the time. The system gets worse and whatever, right? I mean, these systems are not stagnant. They don't stay still, right? There's debate going on in every single country about, well, like how much welfare state should we have versus how much free market capitalism, right? And the rich are very clear in their answer to this, right? Because to the rich, it's like, oh, well, we're the ones who's going to have to pay for a lot of this stuff, and it doesn't affect us. We're not the recipients of the welfare state. So they essentially say, fuck everybody, right? I mean, if you're not rich, fuck you. I mean, that is the situation. So I see it as extremely unrealistic that the Nordic model is going to take root anywhere else, really, right? I don't see that as being the broad tendency of history. unless there's, a big threat, right, in the form of armed, organized insurrection. I don't think you're going to see that model taking place. Look at the United States, right? Is the United States moving in the direction of welfare capitalism? I would say no. I'd say it's moving away from it.
Yeah, I think I don't think that this is true based on a macro look of the systems at play here, right? So, for instance, right, we talk about it is easy, I think, to look at the uh, you could say the uh, in individual examples, right? We can look at, oh, the NHS might get cut here and there. We might scale back some welfare programs here and there, right? But the broad view, the macro view over a lens of time, is that since 1980, since the neoliberal era, we have seen a pretty robust trend over time, and especially if we look even broader, since say the 1900s, of the government taking a more active role in social spending and tax revenue, right? And collecting a part of the economy to redistribute to another part. Now, on one hand, we could say, well, what are they distributing it towards, right? Military spending, the police. The reality is that, I mean, take the U.S. for example. Military spending as a percent of our economy has remained stable or gone down since World War II, right? That what we see is that our economy is about 3.5–4% military spending and consumption, and it's
Yeah, but
actually
that's
remained.
the absolute highest watermark, though. I mean, the U.S. military mobilization under World War II is more significant than any other buildup in the country's history. So if you take that like kind of maximum point, then it's like, okay, yeah, you're going to see a decrease relative to that, right? Because the economy has grown, fast, right, during in the post World War II period. So that kind of measure is very sensitive to your starting point.
Yeah, no, I understand. You're right, but again, but if we look at the broad trend over time, I mean, even since 1980, we've spent a smaller proportion of our economy on war, right, and on, well, I shouldn't say even war, but really just military spending. And I think even from your perspective, obviously, even the most peaceful societies tend to spend at least some amount on self defense, outside of extreme examples like Costa Rica, right? And I think Panama don't have militaries, but they are quite certainly the exception, not the rule. And the point that
Let's just
I,
say I see your overall point, which is that governments do more than they've done 100 years ago. That's
well, right,
unquestionably true.
and yeah, and that's demonstrably true. I'm glad that we can agree on that, and I think that given the fact that it seems that we've agreed somewhat on that point, I don't think that the narrative of, well, if you do good socialist governments or government programs, or you respond to socialists in such a way to acquiesce to their demands, things like healthcare, welfare spending, protection, unionization rights, things like that, that those things inevitably get stripped away over time, doesn't seem to be bore out in the data, and it doesn't really seem a robust conclusion, especially when taking a view broader than simply the United States or the UK, right?
Yeah, but the government doing more, that's true, right? That's a fact. That doesn't equal socialism, right? Socialism does not equal government doing more.
No, I know, but
That's
I'm not saying we're trending towards achieving socialism. That's not even necessarily what I want. It's just that you made the point that social democratic governments is unsustainable, or that it's there's an uneasy relationship there, because these types of social democratic reforms tend to just get eaten away over time. We haven't really seen that over time,
Well,
broadly.
yes, we have, right? I mean, ask anybody who's living exclusively on Social Security, right? Social Security was designed to be social welfare for the elderly, right? What happens if Social Security is your only source of income? You know, United States,
We have
you're poor
septupled.
is the answer. You're poor,
No,
very
no.
poor.
Well, let me go into that, right? Because I
Social
think,
Security does not guarantee a decent life for the elderly, period, right? Would that be part of what you mean by the grand march of social welfare progress? I mean, not even in the wealthiest country in the world do you see that being true.
so if you're asking me, does Social Security equate to, like, $30,000 a year average standard of living across the country? No, but again, we're not talking about, do the question isn't, under my framework, do we have progress to be done? The answer is yes, right? I think we should have more generous welfare systems. I think you can even make that same argument in Nordic countries, right? That's not the question, though. The question is, are these programs unsustainably implemented in the sense that they're simply a short-term acquiescence to socialist movements, either through electoral fear or actual armed, fear of armed revolution? The answer is no. You use Social Security as an example. We have septupled our funding of Social Security over time. Social Security broadly has become more generous, not less, right? We've gone from a 1% payroll tax to a 6.5% payroll tax, right? And so we
No,
might
but the
say,
issue is, does it
well,
guarantee people a decent life
no,
as
no,
they
no,
live?
exactly. And to respond to that question, of course, the answer is that no one living just on Social Security is going to be able to do economically everything they want to do. It is a basic income, a very basic level of subsistence. What we've seen over time is that Social Security has been incredibly effective at reducing poverty, but we have, of course, not guaranteed. Nobody gets $4,000 a month in Social Security, right? But that's not the question. The question isn't Social Security be more generous. The question is, has it become, is it unsustainable? Has it been eaten away over time? The answer to these questions is no. And I think that that's really the point that you made that I'm arguing against.
Yeah, but again, talk to anybody who lives on Social Security. It does not give you any kind of life, you know?
Well, you're not. We're
And
not. Well,
so the
can I
question,
ask
like,
you a question?
is that getting better or is that getting worse? I would say it's getting worse, right? Social Security has been indexed to inflation for a long time, right? But, the way that inflation's been calculated has changed, I mean, like, it famously changed, right, in 1990. Um, so, the inflation rate, not surprisingly, went down there, right, the official inflation rate. I mean, people use the old numbers, right, and they find, higher inflation rate. So, it's kind of interesting, right? The when At the time when Social Security gets indexed to inflation, it gets indexed to a new and lower figure for inflation, right?
Well, I think that you'd have to
But the
demonstrate.
cost of living continues to increase, right? So, for you to say Social Security is better than it was in the past is, I think, that's not data driven,
It is data driven because if it was getting less generous in real terms over time, we would see elderly poverty going up and not down. But elderly poverty is going down robustly over time. And all the studies have been able to show that, in fact, this is inextricably linked to
Elderly
Social
poverty
Security.
is not the right metric, right? Because what you have is you have a semi-public pension system. The system does not work on its own, and so people accumulate private savings to make up for it, right? That's the issue, right? Does the pension system work or not? That's what we're talking about under the banner of socialism. If you say to people, "Look, you better save up your whole life, otherwise you're going to be flat broke and you won't be able to retire. You'll die in the saddle." Right? Well, that's essentially what the United States says, right? You say, "Okay, look, we'll give you Social Security. It's not going to be adequate, right? So you got to at least save some, otherwise you're going to be very poor when you're elderly." So if you take a macro metric like poverty among the elderly, you're including in that a ton of people who saved privately, right? You're not even touching the issue of, does the pension system work? And the answer is no, it does not work, right? Far from your conclusion of that it's getting more generous over time, we barely have a functional pension system, right? That is the actual situation.
No,
And
but
then we could look at other things, right? Like, okay, how about our healthcare system, right? Does our healthcare system cover everyone? I mean, like we already touched on this. Do people want it to, right? This is a democracy. Do we want everyone to have health insurance? The answer is pretty unambiguous. It's yes, right? Vast super majorities of people want that. But are we close to getting that, right? No,
no,
we are
but
not.
I think that this narrative though is
How does
it's
that signal more socialistic to you, right? Like,
no, I'm not advocating for socialism, right? All that I'm saying is that your original claim was social democratic reforms like social security, welfare spending, social assistance, Medicare, healthcare systems spending more generally is not really meant to be a long-term solution to the problem of poverty, but rather an acquiescence to the socialist movements that, they either fear electorally or in an armed sense, right? What I'm saying
yep.
is that Social Security over time has septuple in terms of its funding. If we actually found that capitalists hated Social Security so much that they could just tell the government to get rid of it or to maintain similar levels of funding, they would do that, right? Same thing when you talk about
Well,
Medicare,
they
for
do do that
instance.
though. They do
Well,
do
hold
that.
on.
They say we
Uh,
should privatize it. They say we should
No,
allow,
well,
private investment in Social Security. I mean,
okay, so
that's been the narrative for the last 30 years. They just haven't managed to do it yet because Social Security is an incredibly popular program.
take for
Used to be
instance
considered the third rail of American politics. Touch it and you die, right? Huh.
well, as far
Not
as I'm
this year.
aware, George Bush, Donald Trump, Reagan, I mean, they didn't privatize Social Security, right? And these
They
were,
couldn't get away with it. Yeah. But that
I
doesn't mean that
understand.
of course isn't there constantly eroding public support for it, right?
No, but
And
that
public support also gets eroded by the fact that the program doesn't actually work that well, right? Now it's still very popular, right? Because people understand it's designed to eliminate poverty among a very, vulnerable kind of group, right? A group that we all see ourselves as being part of if we make it that long, right? So it's a very popular program. It's not easy to eliminate it, right? But what can you do? Well, you can starve it a little bit, right? You can make it so that it doesn't really work. Maybe that'll reduce its popularity. I think it's very clear. I mean, like, look at the visionary capitalists who talk about Social Security. What do they talk about? Well, they talk about a universal basic income, which means that they can get rid of every other kind of government welfare, right? Um, and so, where does that leave you, right? My guess is it leaves you worse off, right? If you're the average person. Um, I mean, that's what the visionary capitalists, the Andrew Yangs and whatever, talk about.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It's again, though, I do think that it's not necessarily bore out in the data. I mean, we can talk about the the sort of the micro narrative that these things get eaten away. But again, Social Security has been around for the last 7 years. Talk about the idea of a partial privatization. This is actually what a lot of countries do, right? So, for instance, the Norwegian pension system is predicated on private investment in many different stocks and bonds. In fact, the Norwegian pension system owns over 10% of the domestic Norwegian market, right? I'm not sure if that's necessarily the worst thing in the world, right? Now, when we talk
Depends on
about,
how it's structured, right? I mean, it's not like saying that
of course,
putting it in a private market is by definition bad, but the question is it possible to go, like, is it possible for you to speculate away your Social Security, for example, right? I mean, like, if that's possible, then, I mean, that is kind of like what finance wants, right? Because, the most flexible, most free and financialized, blah, 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 right, is allowing people to control their own portfolio, trade their own portfolio. And that means it's possible for you to be busted, right? I mean, like let's get real,
well,
That's
right,
what
but
they that's
again,
what they want when they say
but
private savings account.
you say that's what they want, right? And I
Sure.
agree that there is a minority of the population that wants that. And there's certainly a minority of the population when looking at the talking heads on Fox News that would want that, right? Of course, we have some agreement there. I wouldn't advocate for taking payroll tax and just redistributing it to people's sort of private speculation accounts. Of course not, right? But that's not what's happened. Your narrative only makes sense if that's actually something that's happened, right? And it hasn't across all of sort of the Western developed world, right? We haven't seen fundamentally the idea of mandatory savings accounts go away. We have the healthcare systems of all of these countries. You keep talking about, well, everyone in the U.S. wants a universal healthcare system. Well, of course, everyone wants the universal healthcare system because everyone wants everyone to be fed and taken care of. True, it's just a matter of can we
Whoa,
actually
whoa, whoa,
agree?
whoa, whoa, whoa. Does
Well,
everyone want that? There is a small group of people in the society that
well,
very much opposes that.
there's a
Everyone fed?
small
Everyone have
there's
health care?
there's a
Everyone have a
small
basic income every month? I mean,
no, but
first of all, that's
Astar.
socialism, and secondly, why would they then work for you? Where would your profits come from if people had all these goodies, all this free
Well,
stuff?
Esther, you're going against your own narrative here with the idea that, oh well, a majority of people or a supermajority of people want universal health care, right? I'm actually agreeing with you, right? Is that yes, of course, a majority of people, if asked on a poll, do you want a universal healthcare system where everyone's covered, they're going to say yes, but there's no ideological consistency in the actual solvency of that problem. Because Republicans think that we should just have the free market, no regulations or anything. Democrats want some regulations all the way from a single payer system, from like a more souped up version of Obamacare. And that's, to be fair, what we see in the European systems. In the Dutch system, all private insurance, but it's universal, equitable, and affordable. In all the way to the UK system, where it's a totally nationalized system. Right now, fundamentally, though, the idea in these countries of universal programs that are affordable, equitable, and quality has not eroded over time. They've tended to only be expanded. If you look at the expenditure on healthcare over time in these countries, it's only gone up, right? And if the capitalist class really had a problem with it and they really did exert such a control over the government as you're saying, they'd get rid of it. But they haven't.
Well, they do have some limitations on them, right? Everyone has limitations on their power, right? I mean, I'm sure you're not telling me that it's not the capitalist class that controls most of the world just because there's a few limits on their power. I mean, is that what you're telling me? I mean, we know who
Well,
runs the world here, right?
no, what I'm saying is that there are different interest groups in a government. Capitalism, or like the quote unquote capital class, basically the wealthiest people of society, is an interest group. Right? I'm not saying they have no influence, and they do probably have an outsized influence based on their wealth, right? But if what you're saying is true, the narrative of these people control the government, therefore that is why we see an erosion of social programs over time. What I'm saying is that actually, number one, we haven't seen that erosion over time as robustly as you're saying, and to really any extent. And number two, if they did have the control that you're saying, we've kind of got a competing narrative. We've got one narrative that says they control the government, they'll cut all your welfare. But on the other hand, they haven't actually been able to. You're saying these programs are so popular, but also they just haven't done that in general. How do you reconcile these two things?
The capitalist class is not unified in general, right? I mean, this is why capitalism fails to address the major challenges of our time, right? Climate change, for example. This is an existential crisis for humanity. Why don't capitalists get together and cooperate and solve it? Well, capitalism is not based on cooperation, right? Capitalism is not based on planning, you know? So when you look at healthcare, you find divisions within different, segments of the bourgeoisie. I mean, like, what would it take to give everybody health insurance? Just case in point, right? Well, we have a private health insurance system, right? Which is a middleman, right? Their whole business is denying you care when you need it, right? That's basically what insurance is. Uh, but we have a segment of the capitalist class which would very much like to have this, right? Like to have universal coverage because they pay for the private costs, right? I mean, my employer gives very good health care, right? Because we have a very strong union. I look at my paycheck, that healthcare costs them $3,600 a month, right? I mean, like, there would be many, many businesses that would love to save that money, even if it meant some higher taxes for them, right? Because they're like, we're already drowning here under the weight of these costs, right? So the capitalist class does not always agree on reforms, does not always agree on this, right? Like, you have a very strong segment of the business class which would like to have everyone have healthcare, right? Just so that people can work harder and work longer, But that requires confronting the pharmaceutical industry and the health insurance industry. And these are very powerful and very well connected, groups that lobby for their policies. So yes, the capitalist class in the aggregate is in charge, absolutely, right? But like any group that of elites that holds power, that doesn't mean they agree on everything, right?
Well, that's sort of, I think, again, though, that kind of goes against this broader narrative of the idea that, in fact, no, the capitalist class does have fairly one-dimensional focuses, right? You might say more specifically,
You want to
they're
see
they're
profit increase, but I mean, there's competition between these different branches, right? So what increases profit for one sector might decrease profit for another. That's the problem.
well, of course, yes. If we're talking about the idea of a nationalized healthcare system, well, we've essentially decommodified healthcare, right? We are offering it to everyone. It's a state-run system at that point, right? Or if we're talking about single payer, we're getting rid of the insurance industry, right? To some great extent, right? 80-90% of the insurance industry, right? That is true, right? But again, that kind of, I think that lends more credence to my point of view, which is that capitalism as a basic sort of mode of production, as a subset, or not a subset, but as a foundational sort of means by which we produce things, economic system, I should say, is more flexible, and it tends to allow, I think, for more wealth accumulation and potential for redistribution otherwise, right? The narrative, I don't think, I think I've proven up to this point that the idea
No,
that,
wait, you haven't established that in the slightest.
well, no, what I'm trying to say is that, no, I wasn't mentioning the idea that capitalism produces wealth. I was mentioning the idea, the thing that I feel like I've proven is not that. I mentioned that as a side point that we can get into later. But the thing that I'm really think that I'm harping on is the idea that, in fact, two things: capitalists control the government, and also capitalists hate social spending to the extent that they'll cut it over time. Now, you mentioned, in fact, actually, I think this is an interesting point of agreement. capitalists and capitalism actually has a diversity within it, and that there's a lot of capitalists that can provide a decent justification, like myself, for social spending. Right, social spending is good for the economy. Right, it's good when people don't live in total destitution. And
Yes, I mean,
I
and
think
this has been kind of the perspective in economic theory since Keynes, right? I mean, Keynes really kind of articulated, right, or what I call like the left Keynesian kind of tradition, right? Because Keynes says the big problems of capitalism are failure to provide for full employment and equality, right? That second point has been a lot less emphasized by Keynesians since then, right? But the idea that a kind of benevolent capitalism doesn't allow itself to become too unequal, does social spending, right? I mean, that's the kind of Keynesian or mixed kind of approach.
right, and that's an approach I think that has broadly shown to be successful over time in a sustainable way. Right, I don't think you. The reason you
Although,
haven't
since you
demonstrated it.
mentioned the word sustainable, we have to kind of admit that global capitalism is rapidly hurtling us toward the edge of a cliff, right? I mean, like, there's nothing really sustainable about any aspect of the global economy. I mean,
Well,
right?
when I you know what I mean when I say sustainable. I'm talking you mentioned the idea that these programs get cut away over time. I feel like we're pivoting now to the environment, which is fine. But to put a pin on the idea or the issue of social spending is that capitalism allows for a significant amount of redistribution of social spending. I think that the data shows that over time, and I don't agree with the
No,
mindset
that
that.
occurs in a few rich countries in the Western core, and most of the world does not experience really any of that, right? I mean, like, we do these bullshit comparisons, right? People say, like, does socialism work? Let's look at Cuba versus the United States. Absolutely wrong comparison, right? Compare this tiny little island with the United States. No, if you want to understand these two systems, compare Cuba with Haiti, right? Now, that's a very stark situation, right? Does Haiti have a lot of social spending? Is Haiti in the Nordic model? No. Cuba is far closer to the Nordic model than Haiti is, right? Is capitalism going to get there on its own? Well, study the history of Haiti, right? And you'll see that the answer is absolutely not. There's no way, right? The Nordic model stays in the Nordic countries more or less for a reason, right? And it can't even be implemented in the richest country in the world. That's my point.
Well,
I
I
don't think
get what
you
you're.
guys have anything different than that.
No, I think I have. I think that we're now narrowing the view quite a bit. The idea of, oh well, in fact, it's only a few countries that have implemented the Nordic model. Well, obviously, the Nordic model is named after the Nordic countries, right? But if we look at the structures of the Nordic model, I don't think they necessarily originated with those Nordic countries. I think the Nordic countries have
Mhm.
arguably just done it the best. But
How would you
you can look.
see Haiti implementing the Nordic model?
Well, I think Haiti has broader views. I think, well, not broader views. I'm sorry. Haiti has problems that it needs to address before its economic mode of production, in my opinion. And I think that that's what they need to address before they even start looking at any sort of economic transformation. I think that the biggest political things foundationally that a country can do to encourage investment and entrepreneurship, which, to be fair, socialists, in the idea of investment and entrepreneurship is obviously not purely a capitalist concept. Socialists need these things too, obviously. And the way that you would encourage those things in Haiti is not necessarily looking at your mode of production. Um, the foundational things you can do is number one, you have to have a government that's not necessarily completely corrupt, right? And international partners are able to work with them to a certain extent, and a government that is able to implement systems by which you can capture the gains of trade and some sort of liberalization, but also investment in general under a socialist or capitalist framework, but distribute those gains appropriately. Haiti just has fundamentally a lack of rule of law, and these are things that are terrible for investment in entrepreneurship and innovation. Like, before we can talk about funding an education system, you probably need to do a lot more things in Haitian society in general. Right. So whether it's socialist or capitalist, that's a conversation for another day in Haiti, in my opinion.
It's funny that you talk about rule of law, though, because like these countries which were conquered by the imperial powers, what the first thing that they did was steal the land. And so what rule of law means now is it means retaining those property rights that were established when the imperial powers stole the land. That's what rule of law means, right? It never means redistribute the land back. It never means, hey, we stole this, we're going to give it back to you, right? It never means give people an alternative to capitalism. Never, ever does it mean that, right? It sounds to me like you're really overlooking the history of imperialism when you look at development in the, outside of Europe, for example, because these countries are still suffering from the impact of imperialism. This is why 9 million people starve to death each and every year, despite there being a global food surplus. There's a tremendous maldistribution of land and other resources. Voting is not going to change that. We've seen that, right? Democracy is not going to change that because democracy's been shackled, right? I mean, we don't have that in the United States, right? We can look at any issue which improves ordinary people's lives. Do we get to vote on that? And the answer is no, we do not, right? Listen, I'm afraid I have another thing, and so I only have this amount of time for this
No worries.
conversation. I'd love to come back at some point in the future because you're a fun person to talk to, and no doubt we have many more issues that we could hash out.
Oh yeah, for sure. I guess last couple minutes, I'll send you a video. Actually, it's funny you mentioned voting won't solve the issue of distribution. Actually, there has never been a famine in a democratic country, and that's an astonishing claim, but it is actually true. And it's because whilst
Well,
food,
this is the point that Amartya Sen makes. Um, it's an interesting one, but it all rests on the issue of what you call a famine. Again, 9 million people starve to death each year globally, despite there being a global food surplus. Where do you think those people starve? I mean, show
was
me a map of where people starve, and then show me a map of where countries that were colonized, and there's going to be an awful lot of overlap between those, right? It's about
well,
the
sure,
maldistribution of natural resources.
and I
And
think
the
a way
fact
to
that if you buy food, then you don't get food, right? Uh,
Yes, and I suppose to close it up, I think a way to solve that is democratic frameworks. I think they've been shown to solve that over time. It's a very interesting concept. Interesting you're familiar with it. I'd love to talk more about it if we can. I guess to close up, tell people where they can find you. I'll definitely link you in the description. Like you said, I agree. It was a very fun conversation, and I'd love to do it again sometime.
yeah, if people want to find me, you can search for my name. It's Asatar Bair. You can search for that on YouTube or on Twitter. I'm active on both of those, and I'd love to connect with you guys if you found something I said interesting. And thanks again for having me on the show. Very very interesting conversation.